Thank you, Gladys. It's a pleasure to be back, and it's a pleasure to be doing this on Zoom. I apologize for the brief delay as I was coordinating Zoom numbers and such, so it's really good to be here, and hopefully the technology will support us throughout our time together. I am going to make an assumption that most of you are in the current role, you are living with or a person, an individual family member in your family who has had a brain injury. I'm going to kind of make the assumption that most of you are in a specific caregiving role. You are either the spouse of the person with the brain injury, or a significant family member, or also just a family member who's helping and supporting the family as they are living through an acquired brain injury experience. I look forward to chatting with you after my little sort of chat with you and my little presentation. I'm open to any questions. Gladys did already email me one question from Dave B. So hopefully my presentation will address that. If not, Dave, please feel free to ask another. But I'm certainly open and willing to answer any questions as best I can. Gladys described me as a person who did experience, as part of a family, living with an acquired brain injury, and that is correct. So I don't have any PowerPoints. This is a presentation. I kind of view this as a talk or dialogue with you for about the first 15 or so minutes of this, 15, 20 minutes. I want to start my talk in a couple of ways. I want to share with you a theoretical framework or a model that helped me in my process of being the spouse of to my husband who had the acquired brain injury. So I'm going to give you a bit of theory, some definitions, and some explanations. Then I'm going to share with you how that theory and explanations fit for me in my experiences. I'll share some of my experiences with you. And then after that, I'd like to open it up for your questions, comments, sharing of your own stories with this, and hopefully this will be a positive and hopefully beneficial time for all of us today. I'll start by saying my husband had an acquired brain injury in the year of 2002. And that's the start of a significant time period in my life. Now, the theory, and it was also my passion for why, when I was in my doctoral program, I decided that I really wanted to find out from other family members what their experiences are like living with a family member who has acquired brain injury. And my doctoral thesis, which I have presented on at several Manitoba brain injury chapters, is titled An Odyssey: Families' Experiences Living with Acquired Brain Injury. In my journey of that, starting my doctoral program and getting my thoughts and ideas going for research, I came across a theory developed by an academic by the name of Dr. Pauline. Her theory is called Ambiguous Loss. And when I read her book, it was like the aha light bulb came on for me, because I found her book in about, I want to say, the third year of my journey of living with acquired brain injury. And I'm just going to reach back in my shelf and grab the book so hopefully you can see it. This is what the book looks like. It's called Loss, Trauma, and Resilience: Therapeutic Work with Ambiguous Loss. I read this book and what she was saying just so fit for me. So let me start by giving you a little bit of her theory. Her theory of ambiguous loss has two definitions. The first definition is a family member is physically missing. So that could be they're in a war-torn country, there's been a significant weather disturbance, and the person is missing. Their body is not located, so it's left with the family of thinking the ambiguity of is my family member who we love, are they alive or dead? So think of that. So that's the definition 1. Definition 2 of ambiguous loss is the reverse of definition 1. So definition 2 states when a person is physically present, yet psychologically absent. So definition 1 is when the person is physically absent, yet psychologically present, because family are thinking, they're worried, is my loved one dead or alive? The ambiguous prospect in definition 2 is the person is physically there. We can see them, touch them, they look the same, but they're psychologically absent. They're missing. They're not the same. And so, as you can well imagine, this definition fits many health and illness situations. Acquired brain injury, Alzheimer's, other dementias, substance abuse, mental illness, all those kinds of things this definition can fit. And Dr. Boss says that this ambiguous loss about, and I'm now going to focus mainly on definition number 2, because that is the better fit for us as we talk about living with acquired brain injury. So Dr. Boss says that this ambiguous loss definition is really, it's an event. So the ambiguous loss event in our case is the event started with the onset of the acquired brain injury event. And that this event, living with acquired brain injury, is the ambiguity of knowing the person is there, but they're not there, is a long-term process. So it's not something that really definitively ends until there's an absolute death. So people are living in this, with this ambiguous state for significant periods of time. Dr. Boss goes on to say that living in this state, living with acquired brain injury, is more stressful long-term than many other kinds of living with chronic illnesses. That this is can be a highly stressful state, and it can impact on caregivers and family members and the individual themselves with the brain injury, emotionally, psychologically, and financially. All those kinds of things, it has huge impact. Now, what also happens when families are living with this ambiguity is that one of the things families can struggle with is something called roles, family roles. In all our families, we have roles in which we function in. With my husband and I, our role was, he was husband, I was wife, we were spouse. We also had other roles. He was a father, I was in the role of stepmother. So we have other roles that families naturally get absorbed into. Now, what can happen when families are living with acquired brain injury and the ambiguity of the situation of living with somebody who's there physically, but is not all there, or is different psychologically and cognitively, who's not there? Living with that can impact on the roles, the usual functioning roles in the household. So, for example, in my situation, because my husband's brain injury was significant in the sense he had multiple bleeds, so he had strokes in his brain, and the strokes affected his brain in the sense that physically, he was fine. He walked, talked, looked the same. He had physical mobility, except, and there was the only physical impact for him was some peripheral vision loss. But other than that, you'd look at him, you'd walk into our house, you'd see him sitting in front of the TV, and you'd say, oh, there's Paul, same guy. But the multiple bleeds caused massive dysfunction in other areas of his brain. So he became, the bleeds affected his ability to have executive functioning, to problem solve, and to have appropriate judgment. So my husband at the time of his stroke was 66 years of age, and he went from being a retired teacher, brilliant guy, articulate guy, computer savvy, loved crosswords, all kinds of things, to being like my 6-year-old son. So that's where the role reversal came in. For me, the impact was I wasn't a wife per se anymore. I was functioning more as the mother to him because of his needs and his inabilities to function in very specific ways. Now, what Pauline Boss also says is this role reversal in some cases, or a role distortion, what it can do is it can impact on the identity of the caregiver or family members who are providing care. So for me, when I started functioning more in the role of mother, I began to have questions that I would ask myself, and it became part of my psychological, stressful, depressed state, is I began to ask questions of myself. Who am I? I'm really not a spouse anymore because I don't feel like a spouse. I don't really act like a spouse. It's not a mutually quid pro quo kind of the same relationship we had before. My husband had significant memory issues. He couldn't cook anymore. He couldn't make decisions anymore. He wouldn't shower himself anymore. He wouldn't know how to, if it was cold outside, he wouldn't know what clothes to wear. I would have to put his clothes out so he could dress. So all these other tasks that I was called upon to do as his loving spouse and caregiver was upsetting to me, because this was not the role that I had been in the previous 15 years of our married life. So it was a huge role reversal, and it really impacted me because it caused me to think of, well, who am I? And that distortion for me led to my own stress and anxiety and depression until I got to figure that out. So in some cases, in what my findings of my research say, is that for some of these families, all of these families went through role reversals. Parents who were retired and who were not parenting in that way anymore suddenly had to become more than grandparents. Who had then become grandparents, but because of a brain injury event to a family member, they had to step back into a significant parenting role. Children took on more parental responsibilities. Siblings took on more parental responsibilities. So all of these adjustments and shifts are what we call role reversals. Now, depending on the level of brain injury and what the impact of the brain injury and the longevity of the functioning of the person with the brain injury, the deficits that they may be living with, the more deficits the greater the degree of ambiguous loss and or role reversals, and therefore impacting on identity, can have in families. Families where maybe the brain injury was less severe may be impacted less, but they are still impacted in ways and are living with this situation, the event of ambiguous loss. So for me, it wasn't until I got the sense that I gave myself a new identity. With support, I found a new identity for myself that helped me regroup for myself as a person. As I became my husband's, like his, how can I put it, like his big sister. That I became the loving sister who could love him, look after him, take care of some of his needs, but I was also allowed to go and have my own life. And that life really, in some ways, didn't include the life of a wife anymore. So I had to figure out what my identity was in order for me to successfully continue and manage and transition and build acceptance and tolerance for living with this ambiguity, this ambiguous event. Because that's what Dr. Boss says we often need to do. Families and individuals need to sort through this process of what it means to accept, tolerate, and build tolerance, find new ways of coping, new ways to build identity for oneself in order, as part of a process of living with the acquired brain injury, instead of constantly battling and becoming even more stressed and other things that happen with that. So that, in a nutshell, is the theory of ambiguous loss. That I've also sort of explained a little bit of what that meant for me, how I dealt, what that impact looked like for me, and then how I had to work towards building resiliency and tolerance and acceptance of not only of living with the acquired brain injury, building a different kind of relationship with the person who had the brain injury, but also building another identity for myself as part of this process. So in some ways, I mean, the relationship with my husband was significantly altered from the moment he had his brain injury. It wasn't a marital relationship in many ways. The relationship had shifted. And so I needed to look at other ways to have a different kind of relationship. That worked for me. I'm not saying that my process or my sense works for everybody, but it is part of highlighting what some of the impacts can be about this particular ambiguous loss event. I'd like to open it up now, if possible. Gladys, if people can put their pictures on, their video if they like, or just unmute themselves, and we can now dialogue. And if there's questions, I think maybe I hope from Dave B, you talked, I mean, your question is the ambiguous loss, and there is a name for it. And it's an identifiable, it's a real thing. That because some of this process people get, I think for some people struggling or living with acquired brain injury, they talk about it as grief and loss. And yes, it is, but it's a particular state, it's a particular event, and it does have a name that means something quite significant for people living with particular ambiguous loss situation. So it does have a name. So comments, questions?
So at this time, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type it in even in the chat, and I can read it out loud just so that
Great, thank you.
Karpa can have a have a chance to answer your question. So anybody who has a question, the time is now.
I mean, is some of this relatable to your guys' experiences? Does this term ambiguous loss, does it ring bells for you? Is it a fit for you, David?
I think I got something maybe that might be like when I got my thing happening with my head, I definitely can't smell anything anymore. And it's very difficult to play music like I used to. And other body functions don't work like they used to.
Right, right.
So and people say I'm a little different, and emotions are different.
Yes.
But I'm still a person. I recognize I'm still a person. I have some quality of life, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah.
So like I'm not sure if I'm having a loss as much as a change. Like I'm accepting what I am now, and trying to make the best of it. I mean, I thought we were going to be all about relationships, but like I guess I'm a cat lady now, so I don't know what to do.
You're a cat. So you're a cat. So do you? How could you, David? Can you speak about some of your relationships with your family?
Well, tragically, my family is everywhere else but here.
Okay.
My mom lives in Saskatchewan, a sister in Quebec, and a brother in Alberta.
Right.
And the person I used to live with, well, that was already kind of tumultuous, and then she was really unhappy I didn't do much after I got hit by a truck. I thought that was rather nasty, but what are you supposed to do? It took a while to even be able to do anything.
Okay, David, can I just stop you there for a minute if you don't mind? What you just described is what Dr. Boss would say, because you sound like you changed when you got hit by the truck. Right?
Yeah, a little bit, I guess.
You couldn't work for what it sounds like you couldn't work. So what Dr. Boss would say is that for some, this ambiguous loss event, the change in you that happened as a result of being hit by a truck, for some of your family members, and maybe for your partner at that time, the ambiguous loss event led to a sense that they couldn't understand it, couldn't face it. So rather than stay to work through and be with it, often families disintegrate, like family members will leave and distance. And so relationships change. For myself, in my family, my husband's siblings didn't come to see him anymore. Friends distanced. Because what happened for them is when they would come to see Paul, they wouldn't know how to engage with him, because even though he knew who they were, but because of his memory losses, he wouldn't know what time of day it was, what year it was, what was going on in the world today. He had better long-term memory than current and short-term memory. So they didn't know how to talk to him. So because I think that they got frightened by that and they were insecure and unsure of what they could do in this relationship, they pulled away. And that can happen in families. So I just want to point out that may be happened to your previous partner, is that she didn't know how to have a relationship.
I'm not so sure about not knowing how, as much as she kind of really relied on me a lot.
Okay.
To do things so well, and
Okay.
it got easier after time on to pick up some slack. But right away it was a pretty tough thing, because
Okay. All right.
To being sort of able to talk again, to here we are now.
Right.
It's a while.
So it sounds like, David, you yourself have come to the point where you've accepted who you are now.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks to the advice of a nice woman who was working in the Riverview Health Center.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you think your family is accepting of who you are now?
I think so. My mom is she's supportive and offers support
Right.
and things. My siblings are kind of like, oh well, because they're off doing their own thing.
Okay.
They're all a little younger than I am, and but there's not really much they can do except be themselves. And I don't really expect anything from them. Just be nice.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you for sharing your experiences.
Well, thank you. You're very helpful.
Okay.
Your words.
Comments from others, if this is fitting for some of your experience or not, or I can also say that the family, go ahead, sorry.
Most people that are family members don't accept that who you are now. That's the reason that they leave.
Yeah.
Because they can't accept who you are now. We have to accept who we are. So it makes it difficult for them and us, because we're trying to deal with the situation that we're in, with the memory loss and the anger and frustrations and all that shit that goes on with us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, okay, we project it on everybody else. It's around us. And it would be great if people could actually realize that accept me for who I am. I only have one person in my life that does. So
right. I appreciate that. And what ambiguous loss, the theory behind it is those family members that you just described, they are also struggling. And they are struggling in a sense of it's a loss because you're not the same and they don't know how to deal with that. So part of what I'm suggesting is that through groups like the one you guys belong to, is to help families begin to move towards accepting, because in some cases, some family members, because they don't know how to deal with it, because they're at an initial stage of, my gosh, you're different, you're not the same, that's the loss, and I don't know how to handle that. Then families distance, people distance. So you're struggling, they're struggling. So my hope is that through spreading this word about this ambiguous loss, is that we can start talking with yourselves and family members to come to points where they don't have to distance. Can we help them support to come to realize how to accept your difference? What needs to happen so that they can come around, and I'm sorry I don't know your first name, that they can come around to accept you, like you've accepted yourself, David's accepted himself. But family members need to be offered the same kinds of supports to be able to learn how to do that.
yes, but they also have to accept that they want to even go and try to figure out.
That's a very key point as well.
That
yeah,
is out there for yourself and for other people. You went out of your way to learn as much as you could,
right?
Which helped you to deal with the situation you were in.
Yeah.
With our family and friends, they have to want to accept us and want to actually find out why things are happening. And unless they're going to do that, then there's always going to be that distance between us.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I hear that there is. My hope would be that sometimes if those people could hear somebody like me or others who were family members, that even by listening, it may help opening up opportunities to engage. But I hear what you're saying, totally. I get it.
But they have to want to actually go to a meeting and meet with other people.
Yeah, that's tough. That's a tough one.
Went through, and as a family member, if you have somebody in your family that's an alcoholic, you've lost that person.
Yeah,
It's the
exactly.
same with, and unless you go to, like, they can go to the Alcoholic Anonymous, but unless you go to the opposite meetings, you're never going to understand where they're coming from or even how to help them.
Yeah.
So with us, and what I believe is that we have to, I mean, it's out there. We have the Manitoba Brain Injury Association has meetings. It's out there on the internet and that hey, you know, if you, this is what, you know, you can come to these meetings and it's going to help the individual. We have our meetings and we help each other to get through some of the problems that we have. It's and it's a win-win situation.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing is that the people, and there's been a few people that brought their children or brought their better half or somebody, they brought somebody with them to our regular meeting. And because of that, they started to understand what's going on. They brought, you know, and that's to our regular meeting, because then they see other people that are in the same, you know, that are the same as what we're going through.
Mhm.
All the anxieties and anger and all that stuff, it's there. And again, it's them accepting that we're different now. We're a new person. It's like being reborn. So the individual that is a caregiver is going to have to be, as you say, the mother, the father, or the sibling. They're going to have to be, that's their role to begin with, which is very difficult for most people. As I said, you went out of your way to learn things. I went out of my way to learn as much as I could about what I'm going through, why I'm going through it. And that's basically what saved me. Otherwise, I mean, I lived in BC and I was alone. So
Yeah.
I didn't have anybody to bounce things off of, or
Right.
you know, really, I don't know, maybe care or whatever.
Okay.
It was difficult.
Yes. Yes, I'm hearing that. Okay. Comments from others?
I was thinking that, as the last gentleman was speaking, that he wants the caregiver to accept that he's a new person and that he's not the same as he used to be, and the caregiver has to accept their new responsibilities. As a caregiver, I think it's nice to know that the survivor recognizes that we caregivers have had a major lifestyle change also. And I think from what I've read, from quite a bit of reading that I've done, that doesn't always happen, that sometimes the survivors think that they're the same as they always were, and the whole problem is the caregiver. And would be nice to know that the caregiver to know that the survivor recognizes that it's not just them that's had a major lifestyle change.
Well, I agree with you 100% in that. And yeah, it has to be a two-way street. There's no, here's one person, here's another person, we're way apart. We have to recognize what's going on. One of the things that, like, I go to Riverview, and we started a new group in Selkirk and stuff like that. And anybody that I can talk to, I tell them that if you have somebody that has a brain injury, I respect that person, because they're going through as much shit as what we go through. Sorry, but
Mhm.
That's what it comes down to. It's the same thing. We project out on that person, it comes back. So they have to, it's not so much recognize that we're different, that we're a new person, but they also have to understand that they have to want to try and help each other out. I think that's what it comes down to.
Okay, I noticed there's some couple of other comments coming in, but I want to go back to the lady. Sorry, I because your names aren't here, I don't know who you are. So I'm just going to say the lady who just spoke. And what both you and the gentleman who just spoke, what I think I hear you saying, what you're describing is that because the brain injury, the deficits can be complex. The deficits can be from mild, moderate to severe. That means that the relationships can become complex. And when you think you would like the partner who has the brain injury to, on some level, recognize that you too are impacted. You're impacted positively, you're impacted negatively, but you are also impacted. But sometimes through the deficits, our partners aren't able to see that. So then what happens, again, I'll speak from my husband's experience. My husband his deficits were such that he had no empathy to understand my state, to understand the struggle of living with this, the impact on me. So I had to search out and find support and help outside of that to help me manage it for myself, because he couldn't give me that. The relationship that we had as spouses prior to his brain injury, absolutely he could have, but he couldn't have. So that's why Dr. Boss says the state of the difference of having somebody who's physically there yet different significantly impacts on the relationship, because the qualities of that relationship change. And they change for both, and they also change for other family members. And those changes can be positive and they can be negative. So that's what I hear the woman speaking about is that you still want to get some empathy, and if you're lucky that you've got a spouse who can still give you that, that's great. But for others of us, because of the severity of the brain injury, that part of the relationship may be non-existent anymore. So then that leaves a void. So how do we fill that? How do we move forward with that? So who had a question here? How does one start to redefine the relationship? I think the starting place is to talk about that it even needs to be redefined. I think talking is the first place, is to pronouncing it, announcing it, naming it, and talking about it. That's the first place, because unless and I guess, because that helps in recognition, that helps one in understanding that these things are happening, that they're real. Because it's, again, the other part of the brain injury is often our injuries are hidden. So it's also hard for family members and friends to accept the hiddenness of the deficits. So that, so people don't understand. They don't understand what they don't see. So that also is hard for families and friendships, because they don't understand it. And you're quite right. Some of them, it's because they don't understand. Often I think why family members back off and walk away is because they're scared. They're frightened because they don't know what to do. It's unfortunate, but that's a reaction that can happen. And I guess this is why when you guys talk about what my findings found and what I am pushing or trying to get the word out in various ways is the families that so kindly offered me their stories and their experiences. These were resilient families. They had tremendous strengths, and these were families that actually stayed together as family. But they also had their struggles with the healthcare system, in that in hospital or early in rehab or whatever, it's appeared to be, from their stories, that healthcare professionals weren't identifying and talking about the potential experiences of what living with acquired brain injury, what some of the things could be going on. Like that, I think healthcare professionals like to give education about the physical things, about rehab appointments, about all that kind of stuff. But healthcare professionals need to do more to start talking about families and the impacts on relationships. Because I think that's missing. That's missing. And then you guys are trying, the groups are trying to develop. You guys got to get your supports from somewhere. And I think we as healthcare professionals can do a far better job of preparing, or at least opening up, implanting the seeds that there could be these areas that you guys will need to process through. And we suggest, that, when there's times that you're, that be prepared, because these could be potential process issues for you guys. Because almost all the families, again, that were part of, that shared their stories with me, they all experienced changes in their relationships, changes to each other, and they were resilient. They worked through those, they supported each other. But often, most of the families also experienced changes with friends, like friends disappeared. They didn't come around anymore. So relationships can and do change, which is one of the more negative impacts of living with acquired brain injury.
You made a very good statement about healthcare, and they need to do more to help both sides, but they need to do more to actually recognize and to do something about it, because there isn't much there.
Yeah, that's why I started this presentation on the theory, because what you guys all experience has a name, like it's a real thing. It's not made up. It's a real thing. It has a name. It can be identified. It can be called ambiguous loss. So once even talking, even knowing that, you guys now may go out and search more and talk and find out more about ambiguous loss and stuff, because it's real. It has a name. It exists. And I think healthcare professionals need to hear about this so that they can pass on the same information.
Jane?
Yes.
My name's Barbie Nault. We used to work together years ago.
Oh.
When you were working with Ron Arneson at Productive.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yes, years
nice
ago.
To see you. Nice to see you.
It's been a long time.
Yes.
So, our family has found ourselves in a very tragic situation, but we're dealing with a pediatric brain injury. And I'll be actually doing a presentation next week.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering where you found through your journey most of your supports.
I chuckle because this is, I guess I want to say, this is, for me, this was, I don't want my experience to cloud others.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, to be honest and to be transparent, my experience in this regard was a sad and disappointing experience for me. Because I didn't get support from family and friends. The healthcare system at the time, when, I mean, I had home care supports because when my husband was released from rehab at the hospital, the health science center, they basically told me he was deemed non-rehabable. So I had the option then to place him in care or to bring him home. And my husband understood enough that he begged me to bring him home, like he wanted to be with me. So I said yes. So I had home care supports. I had a person in charge of the file, I guess, that would come and see how things were in my home. But never once, when that person came to check on things and to assess, never once was I asked how I was doing. It was always, I mean, and I'm just speaking again, this was my experience as a caregiver, as a family member. I wasn't asked how I was doing. And it was, you know, I would answer for Paul because he couldn't answer questions about his meds or how he was doing. So I was there to answer those. And so the assessments were about him. But when I knew I was struggling, when I needed help, and when I attempted to say to the system, I need help, the response I got from a person in the system was they put up their hands and said, well, what do you want me to do about it? So I hired somebody to help me, which is a sad and ludicrous thing to say, but that's what happened. So I got some help, but I you know, but I don't know. I don't want to cloud it with all the bad and negative. But so how can I ask how your experience has been? Because sometimes with pediatric head injuries, because of the age in itself of being a pediatric head injury, I think the healthcare system is more attuned to the family. They recognize that this child has got a family around them. At least that's what the literature is saying. But can you say something about how it's been for you?
Yeah, and I am going to be speaking about this next week on the 23rd, but certainly I would say that, you know, you're kind of bang on. Like if and we're in a very fortunate situation, our family, we're very blessed because I'm a case manager.
Yeah.
That's what I do. So I have experience navigating through systems and advocating. So, but I've had to do that on my own and make sure that our daughter has had the supports.
Wow.
And then, yeah, we're very lucky because I can't imagine the number of people.
You know, I got to say that I applaud you for your ability to do that through living with the brain injury. I got to a point I couldn't do that. I was so exhausted, so stressed, I couldn't advocate for myself. So I applaud you in your abilities. Kudos. That's a real tremendous strength. That's really good.
Well, you know, we've been very blessed that we've had my husband is a huge support as well. So it's
That's great. That's great.
And
yeah.
He's a school administrator, so he looked after the re-entry into school.
Yeah. Okay.
I looked after the medical piece, so we were able to split that. And the siblings have also played a huge part in learning about her injury and understanding. And yeah, there's been challenges, absolutely. But I mean, the key thing is to educate and create awareness. And that's kind of my new path.
Yeah.
It becomes your focus, right? I mean, it's and your passion, because if not, the person who's going to suffer is our entire family, because it is a family affair. And especially our daughter, we want to make sure she has the best supports that we're able to provide.
Absolutely. Now I'm gonna challenge a little bit too, if that's okay,
Sure.
from what I hear you saying, because I think also Pauline Boss would say, and the families that I've heard from as well, it's interesting that the acquired brain injury becomes such a force of focus in their lives. It becomes a central stage, right? There's no other way. So, and I just pose this because there's a parts of life that I still needed to be me. And when was it okay for me to be me and not think acquired brain injury? Like kind of, yeah, I needed a break, just to go off and be, without having it be such a central force for me. I'm curious about that, because I hear families talk about that. I fully recognize this is such a central, dominating way of being and living.
It is. So what we've done there is finding care for our daughter was a huge issue, and we've been fortunate that a family member is doing that, because we just had a number of unfortunate experiences with strangers coming into our home, and not just being vested and not being educated in brain injury. And so family has really stepped up. And so my husband and I have both been able to work, which allows us to feel, we still have that other part of us that hasn't been lost, and makes us better caregivers.
Okay. So you've been able to glom on to still a significant identity for yourself that's allowed you to maintain resiliency. That's great. That's great. Great. Have you noticed relationship shifts? I'm hearing your family's close and they're supportive. Are there relationship shifts that you're also noticing, positively, negatively, or?
Well, we've lost most of our close friends.
Okay.
I don't want to say that we've lost them. We still love them, but it's
Right.
the lack of understanding. And so we need to surround ourselves with life-giving people who understand, and when we spend time with them, that we're going to become energized, as opposed to having our energy reserves being depleted. And so we surround ourselves with people who understand our situation and who get it. And that is family. Unfortunately, there's only a few close friends who really get it. And everything is about environmental controls. So people need to understand that if we go out, it may only be for an hour. And that's where, because that's all our daughter can handle with the noise and the specifics that come along with brain injury. So everything is very structured and routine, and people need to know if we need to have a strategy to leave. That's what it is, and that's our new reality, and it's working for us right now.
Okay, good. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, there's another question here. Based on your research, what did families do for their relationship to thrive despite the changes? Again, this is, I keep saying the word resilience, because the families that told me their stories, they spoke about the stress, the emotions, the times, but they had this force of commitment to one another, whether it was about love and support, and this idea that we're just going to do this. Like our belief system, their belief systems were, you know, we're just going to do this. We're going to persevere, and we'll get through this, and we'll adjust. We'll make the changes, and that's what they did. But I know there's stories from families where that didn't happen. That wasn't the case. So it's, again, families and acquired brain injury, they're complex, and there's no one easy answer. It's dependent on families, it's dependent on the severity of the brain injury, and it depends on the family dynamics pre the brain injury that can impact on the family dynamics post brain injury as well. So there's no definitive one way or right way, but it's a working through. And I think the gentleman who spoke about the idea of just supporting and accepting, I think that's the point you get to, but you often don't start there. I can remember, I hope I don't get too bored with me sharing some stories here, but an example of that for me was because eventually my husband was placed into a home care situation because I just crumbled. I fell apart. I couldn't do it anymore. And I could never get used to the fact that he would constantly say, like, "What time is it, Jane? What time is it?" And I would tell him the time, and then a minute later he'd ask the same question. Or the times when he was placed in the home, I had got him a big phone machine that had big numbers, and the home number was on speed dial. So the times where he would phone on the speed dial, I mean, I felt guilty if I didn't pick up right away. I felt guilty when he called that I needed to answer it. I needed to be there because this was my husband and this is what I should be doing. But it came a time, it was rather freeing for me when I recognized, you know, a couple of times, because he never left a message. I don't think he knew how to function and to do that anymore. His deficits were such that. But if at the odd time, if I didn't, I would call him an hour later and I'd say, "Oh, hey, babe, you called me." You know, he said, "Oh, did I?" So it was rather freeing for me to sort of say, you know, Jane, if I saw his number come up on call display, I could say, "Well, I'm busy right now." It was freeing for me to say, I don't really need to answer that right now because he won't even remember making the call. So that became a point of acceptance for me. It's just really accepting this is who he is. And then how I respond in relationship to that I didn't need to be guilty, but this is who he is. Rather than fighting and battling and getting so frustrated and saying, "Oh my God, why can't he remember? I'm so angry. I'm so frustrated. I'm giving him the time 100 times a day. It's really bugging me. Gosh darn it." You know, I would just kind of say, "Oh, okay." And that relieved me of so much angst, is just to say that, to accept that. But it took almost like a year for me to go through this process of kind of getting to the acceptance from who he once was to being this different person now. It took me time to get to that point. And by shifting my identity also helped me to accept who he is now. But I think, you know, when I hear stories of family members who have Alzheimer's, and they get so upset and they get so frustrated when the person maybe doesn't remember who they are, and and to me, accepting who the person is in their Alzheimer's state means just accepting, like getting to a point of accepting they're not going to remember me, and that's okay. So there's an emotional let go of some part of this acceptance process. There's an emotional connection to this, that you let go of the loss of that person being different and just accepting that this is who they are now. That's not only a cognitive thinking process, but it's also an emotional letting go process, because that's part of the loss, is that they're not the same. I'll put on the chat. Okay, the question, this is a great question. Does ambiguous loss follow the same path as the 5 stages of acceptance? I'm not too familiar with the 5 stages of acceptance, but it may be similar processes in getting to the acceptance stage. Because well, the hardest part again was kind of letting go of the emotional thing of sometimes the very little things, you know, like him asking, you know, what's today's date and what time is it, just drove me nuts it just drove me nuts. And I found it so frustrating that and yet still felt guilty if I didn't respond. And it was just that part of it drove me nuts. So that was very difficult for me to live with that on an ongoing basis. The other thing that missed was our sexual relationship, like that we had as a marital couple. That changed, totally changed. And it changed for me when I kind of went from not being in my own head. I wasn't really being a spouse anymore. If I was more of a parent, I started to have feelings, well, as a parent, like I'm really not interested in sex with this person anymore. And that's just how it is. I'm not there. So that was also part of a relationship struggle, a huge shift that impacted on our on my feelings, or my identity and my role with him shifted, changed dramatically. There's 5 stages of grief. Okay, rather than acceptance. Okay, the ambiguous loss, I don't think is that formulaic. It doesn't go in specific stages. So no, it's different. The ambiguous loss process is different. Because the loss process is different. The 5 stages of grief are more of a framework for when there is an actual death. And people say you go through a grieving process like Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. That's specific to an actual death. So getting to acceptance with the ambiguous loss event, the ambiguous loss situation, the ambiguous loss feelings is a bit of a different process because it's long-term. Because I lived with my experiences living with acquired brain injury were the last 4 years of my husband's life. He died in 2006. But for many families, and for Barbie, who talked about the pediatric, you're going to be living with this ambiguous loss situation for the lifetime of your child, right? Like it's going. Like the longevity of that is a long time. So what the literature will say is that there will be different phases and processes of acceptance, and that certain times will draw you back into something else. But the longer term, when you get to acceptance, you can begin to stay in that period. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. It was a convoluted answer, but. How are we for time? I don't want to take up. Okay, great, thank you. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was informative. I appreciated hearing from you. I appreciated you taking the time. Oh, David, I love your Christmas hat. That's great. Thank you guys so much. It's always nice chatting with you. And I wish you well in your journey, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you so much, Jane, for accepting our invitation. So keep safe. Thank you. And thank you for everyone who actually participated today. So if you want to review or you want to listen to the to this webinar, you can access our YouTube channel and we'll upload it there as soon as we Zoom. Okay, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.